Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this is the podcast for you. What is happening, legends? Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Today you've got Ayden Doumtsis and I, James Doumtsis, and we are going to be running you through our awesome Banteng adventure that we had recently in the Northern Territory. As I'm sure a lot of you would have seen, we've got that Northern Territory series coming out at the moment, Bowhunting Banteng Boars, a 4-part series where we were lucky enough to go up to Dingo Creek Hunting Safaris and tackle a few banteng and have an awesome trip on the boars as well up there in Cobourg Peninsula. So today we're going to be discussing that in more detail, giving you a bit of background about the hunting operation Dingo Creek and also just a few features around hunting banteng as well. So if you guys would also like us to answer your questions on the podcast, please make sure you send them in to us via our email, which is info@twinelements.com.au. Or you can send that through to us on Instagram at our Twin Elements account, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors account, or James Doumtsis Outdoors account, and we will answer it on a future podcast. But for now, we'll jump in and discuss all things banteng and Dingo Creek hunting. Option Archery makes specialist hunting gear. I'll never not be able to use equivalizer again. They're truly one of my favourite bits of kit. It combines a stabilizer and equivalizer to increase the functionality of my hunting strategy. It enables me to put my bow on my shoulders, which enables me to glass more when I'm out in the field. Shop both equivalizers and their option sight range today by heading to the website. So we were lucky enough to go up and hunt with Stephen Patterson, or Patto. I'm sure if you guys on here that listen are familiar, Patto is an absolute legend, and he's had Dingo Creek Hunting Safaris for quite a few years now, originally starting more to do with buffalo and boar hunts, and recently getting into more of the banteng side of things up there. So he was in the Cobourg National Park for quite a while, but just recently has gone up onto the Murgenella Floodplain and started guiding up there, where there is plenty of opportunities for great banteng bulls, as I'm sure a lot of you guys would have seen from our videos. So the Murgenella Floodplain is an extremely remote area where there's essentially a paragrass flats, it gives plenty of opportunity for feed. So there's brilliant numbers of banteng. To get to Murgenella, what you've got to do, or Cobourg Peninsula, what you've got to do is fly into Darwin or do the very long trek up from anywhere all the way up. And you're traveling through Jabiru, which is a small township, and then back up to Cobourg. As you can imagine, there's very limited access into these very remote communities and areas. And it's quite a logistical nightmare type of hunt. You've got to make sure you've got a very good vehicle, and that's where having good outfitters like Patto are extremely important to allow access, where they maintain really good connections with the Indigenous who manage the hunting in these areas, and that's why there's very limited opportunities to hunt banteng legally. There's only a couple of guys doing it, and Patto is definitely one to keep on the cards if you think about doing a banteng hunt in the future.
So I hear James discussing banteng, and honestly, for a long time, as someone that lived here in Australia and knew about a lot of the deer species on offer, feral pigs, goats, rabbits, foxes, my eye as a young lad sort of shifted towards the Northern Territory, and obviously the possibilities that sort of were out there, mostly in the form of bow hunting, sort of buffalo, maybe scrub bulls, donkeys, camels, all these sorts of big game species. And then one day I stumbled across banteng. So I didn't really have the best knowledge up until sort of more recently, when this hunt and over the last few years has sort of started coming into formation. But for those that don't know, basically banteng are a wild cattle of species, bovine species native to Southeast Asia, mainly coming from Indonesia, hence why we often refer to them as like barley cattle. There's also countries like Cambodia, parts of Thailand, and Burma where they're originated. They were introduced here to Australia in 1849 when the British established a settlement at Port Essington, which, as James sort of mentioned earlier, was deep in Cobourg Peninsula up here in the Northern Territory in Australia. And the animals actually came from barley itself, and these were to serve pretty much as a meat source for that early British settlement as they sort of, set up their camps and everything like that, and were trying to harness a bit of that remote coastline that is Cobourg. So when that Port Essington settlement ultimately failed and was abandoned in 1849, the settlers left the cattle behind, or these barley cattle, which were pretty much domestic cattle at that point, coming from barley. And then over time, they've become obviously feral over a couple hundred years, and fully reverted back to basically a wild population of bovine spread across much of the Cobourg Peninsula, and even down into parts of Arnhem Land. So one thing that is interestingly of note is that this species, even though they've come from barley and they're feral here in Australia, they are geographically isolated from any other herds. Like there aren't any herds of domestic banteng, further down south in the Northern Territory or in certain places that can mix and mingle. So I think in theory, this herd is still very much of the same genetic makeup of what's come across originally from barley, which is an interesting factor when considering that they're actually considered, the largest pure population of wild banteng left in the world here in Australia. The current population, as far as I know, is estimated to be at a few thousand animals. And to be honest, those estimates are probably quite inaccurate. And, whether it's 1,000 or 10,000, there's a massive variance there, obviously. And I think there just needs to be a lot more research into it, a lot more working with these outfitters and stuff, as is probably the case with most feral animals here in Australia. But hopefully what you get and hear in this podcast is that they are definitely pretty iconic here in Australia now. They're considered to be an endangered animal back home or globally, in Bali, Indonesia, these places within Southeast Asia. Yet here in Australia, they're actually classed as a feral animal, and rightfully so, but with a bit of work and things like that, they could be classed more as a resource. And that's something that obviously these guides and outfitters obviously see them as. So in the Northern Territory, it is important to notice that they are managed, through limited guided trophy hunting opportunities, as James said earlier, with very few outfitters actually having legal access to do so. And this is all done through allocated permits and tags and that type of stuff, which is very important when it comes to hunting banteng here in Australia. And again, as hunters and stuff, we need to do our due diligence to know that what we're doing is ethical and legal and all that type of stuff, because at the end of the day, we are hunting an animal that's, endangered, and their status here in Australia is probably a little bit up in the air at the moment until we have, better infrastructure in place to manage this species.
Just touching on that, I think it is very important that what us as hunters, especially Australian hunters, I feel we sometimes try and, we want to just do DIY hunts and all that type of stuff. But I feel like in this circumstance, it's one of the few times where these animals could quite easily just be exterminated from there. Obviously not being a native animal. We see it all the time, whether it be the chopper shooting in New Zealand, all that type of stuff. And I feel like as hunters, we need to be sort of more invested in the politics of hunting, I guess. And I feel like this is a good stance in the sense that it would be very easy for them to go in there and remove all these animals. Whereas having guides in place, and yes, you've obviously got to pay to go and do that hunt, but it puts sort of an economic value on that animal, and the whole saying you got to pay to play, is very true in this circumstance where we're obviously paying, like these outfitters, it's quite an expensive hunt, we're not going to lie. But these outfitters are paying very high tags back to the NLC and back to these Indigenous communities, which enable us to be able to hunt these banteng. And hence the whole saying, you got to pay to play. And also, I guess, in this saying, stay. Because if people aren't making money off these things, like it's very easy for the government to just come and remove these banteng from this environment. Hence, but to then sit there and be like, okay, well, these guides across all the legal guides in, the Northern Territory, just say they're putting a couple of $100,000 into the Indigenous communities and stuff like that, obviously into conservation, NRC, and managing these herds. Well, all of a sudden that stands up when they want to remove the population because of potential disease threats. Like obviously lumpy skin disease, and like from a veterinary background from Ayden and I, like lumpy skin disease is a massive threat, tuberculosis, like all these things that are very close. There's only a couple of 100 kilometers of water separating us from Indonesia. And so when they go, okay, well, that's a bovine that can transmit this disease. If we can say that we've got, something that improves the economy where people are traveling up to Darwin, they're renting a car, or, they're paying these outfitters that are putting money in the local community because you've got to stay at a hotel, you've got to buy your food, you've got to get your mechanical, like how many tires do we go through in this trip as you get through and all this type of stuff. Then all of a sudden you've got an economy built off hunting, and then that has a value. Whereas the second where, a lot of people, I realize they probably want to do it on the cheap and just want to do it on the back of the car. But that's where it's like for those guys that, I'd encourage you to do it properly. And I'd also encourage you to make sure, like, if you're talking to outfitters, there's plenty of guys that do it out of the back of their car, but make sure you've got a tag. Because I mean, legally, even like you're not even meant to be in Cobourg with hunting equipment if you don't have a tag. So that's where it's like people like Pato, and there's some other great outfitters up there, but make sure that it's all legit, because firstly, just from a hunting conservation point of view, but also because you don't want to be caught with someone, without a tag, that's just doing it on the cheap out of the back of their car. Because there will be obviously, especially, I mean, whether you're a bow or rifle hunter, there will be massive repercussions for you, in potentially loss of vehicle, or also loss of, rifle licenses, gun licenses, those type of things. So, it's one of these circumstances that it really does pay to have, a professional outfitter like Dingo Creek.
And that's where, again, like having a little bit of ignorance in the topic and again, not knowing a heap about Banteng, getting up there and just being, honestly, it was like opening a can of worms, hearing, from these guides and outfitters, whether it's Nick Joyce talking about it, Pato, Alex Jaggers, some of these guys that we've got reputations with and obviously relationships with, we've spoken about at length, and they just give you an insight into what they're up against daily and the daily struggles. And I guess the uncertainty sometimes of how much money and infrastructure and work and sleepless nights they're putting into trying to secure this, legally and ethically and all this type of stuff. And then at the same hand, the government could come in and just get rid of that herd overnight and shoot what is, thousands of animals and things like that. And then their livelihood, the money that's going to those Indigenous communities can be taken away literally in the click of a few fingers. So try not to focus on that too much. I guess it is worth probably looking into the physical traits of these animals, and some of the stuff that, as we started seeing a few animals, was really, really cool to see. Because I know that with Banteng, I'd seen photos, seen videos, watched a few other hunts and stuff on YouTube, but one thing that stands out immediately when you start looking and laying eyes over these animals is just the color variation in them. So the bulls are typically quite dark in coloration. And when I say dark, the mature bulls are nearly always completely black with white sort of markings, whether that's their white rump and their what we call stockings, so like their feet up to about their knees. They're pretty much completely white, unless they've been in mud and obviously, change that color. The younger bulls are sort of a darker sort of roan browny coloration. And then where it varies quite heavily is that the cows and the young calves are a reddish sort of tan brown with the similar white markings, of course, but they're just almost like a very caramelly color, and they stand out so greatly. Like if you put a bull and a cow next to each other, there is the slight size variations. But the biggest thing that stands out is that those males are nearly completely black. And again, the sexual, I guess, dimorphism is pretty interesting, like where both sexes have completely different horn, characteristics as well. Like the bulls more typically have upward horns typical of like, a Brahman cow, for example, or any type of cattle where they come up out of the head and sort of curve outwards. Whereas most of the females, I'd say, just from our observations and what we saw, most of the cows seem to be more down-horned and even curved, sometimes to the extent where the horns would like flop down towards their eyes and almost curve back into their head. And again, obviously being feral animals with no intervention from humans, their horns would grow into their head in instances, and there's no one there like to run them through the yards like we see with our domestic cattle, trim their horns or anything like that. So that's just another way that nature's sort of obviously controlling things is by having these cows grow horns back into their heads, which would be, you can imagine, extremely painful and a bit of an inconvenience. And again, it was interesting. A lot of the bulls have these upright horns where some of the cows had almost like pendulous, like floppy horns that weren't really, they'd like flop down by their face, but if they moved or ran, it was almost like the layer of skin was the only thing sort of holding those horns onto their head. It wasn't like they were actually sort of like very firmly structured onto the skull, which was definitely different to the bulls, which I think have that strong connective tissue in the middle of their horns called a boss, which is very similar to what Cape buffalo have in South Africa. And something that, species such as buffalo, whilst they've got horns, obviously lack that connective tissue or the boss that we call it in the middle. And again, comparing them to, a species like water buffalo, yes, whilst they're big, black, formidable, a species to hunt, they do differ in the way that their horns are sort of structured. And I think the Banteng, for me, are definitely way more wary. They're still a tough species to hunt. They definitely have thinner skin, but they are very, very agile. Like even when you shoot a buffalo, they just seem to knock down timber and run through things. Whereas you shoot a Banteng, and they seem to just be able to like dodge through the trees, duck and weave a little bit, and they're super, super fast on their feet, which was cool to see.
Yeah, I feel like just in their tendencies to be how alert they are. Like a buffalo, not to talk down on them at all or anything like that. But a buffalo, I mean, if they're hunted a lot, they're fairly switched on. But just in these Banteng, especially hunting in these really remote areas where it's very unlikely that they get hunted, much at all, if ever, they're still super switched on animals. Like they can more be led to, being as switched on as a deer, but I wouldn't say they're like at the level of a deer, but they're certainly like, they're going to pick you out if you're moving like from 100, 150 meters away, whereas a buffalo sort of a bit, like they probably will too, but it's just sort of one of these things like that. The Banteng were just that next level above, just being switched on, and they'll hear you crunching through leaves, and they'll definitely see, like they had very good eyesight. But the big thing was their agility. Like they almost run like a deer in the sense of like they're not like just plowing through stuff. They're sort of ducking and weaving and jumping over logs and this and that. And interestingly enough, they actually at one stage crossbred like Banteng bulls into the PBR, into like all the bull riding stuff. And they, from my knowledge, they've actually stopped doing it because the bulls were too, I don't want to say psychotic, but the bulls were like too aggressive and too, like their movements were just like erratic. And yeah, they were like too hard to ride, so everyone just sort of not cancelled, but everyone complained about how hard they were, and they've stopped doing it. But that sort of gives you an illustration of how agile these things are, and it's actually incredible seeing them run through really thick bush because, yeah, like Ayden said, like unlike a buffalo that just sort of plows through and they're almost impressive because it's like a small tank just breaking through saplings. Like a Banteng will duck and weave and go through, and it's just sort of a completely different style, I guess, and really awesome to see.
Know where you stand with Onyx, the most accurate GPS mapping tech for outdoor enthusiasts, featuring land ownership maps that work offline, trusted by millions of hunters worldwide. We utilize Onyx while hunting in the United States on James's elk hunt of a lifetime. Being able to plan and prepare for our hunts allowed us to go farther and hunt with confidence. So our first morning of the hunt, I was lucky enough to be up first with the bow and James following behind with the camera gear. And what was really cool and sort of unforgettable, the whole trip was, you'll hear us refer to it in the film on the YouTube series, but we often refer to it as like a pinch yourself sort of moment. And I remember, so we were camping with Pato from Dingo Creek, and we had a bit of a mobile camp, and we're sort of doing a bit of a DIY hunt under him where we brought all our own gear because I was living in the Northern Territory, and Dad and James flew in to come and experience it, obviously, and hunt and stuff like that. And, immediately we woke up on the sandy beach there of the Cobourg Peninsula, and where we were camping was a fair way away from where we were hunting, but it was pretty cool to just see the wildlife. And we rocked up into camp and met people, and it's just to put into perspective as to how remote it was and how wild this place is and untamed it is the week before we were there was a 4 meter long saltwater crocodile just off the front beach there eating a green sea turtle. And you hear that and go like, where else in the world is that occurring? Like, where else, is that just happening on your front doorstep? And like, to then obviously go and sleep a couple hundred meters up the bank, roll your swag out, have a coffee in the morning and set off to do this bow hunt. Like, we hadn't even seen or thought of a bangtang up until that point, but it was just a cool part of the world. And I guess, taking all of it in, it's something that like so much is happening around you during the hunt. It wasn't until we sort of go back and now we're re-editing and re-watching all this footage that I'm like, holy shit, this hunt was so much more than just like a hunt for bangtang, but like an incredible, unforgettable adventure in a remote part of the world. And I think, we sort of couldn't help but approaching and tackling this hunt, obviously with the knowledge from Pato, and he pointed us in the right direction. But even ahead of the trip, we try to download, offline maps and GPS kit, which is something that we commonly use. We looked at all the rivers, creeks, little green pockets and the floodplains and any isolated water holes that we might be able to target looking for game. But what was probably most striking to me is where we started the hunt was a fair way away from like, where we ultimately found the bangtang. And it took a bit of like working it out, which is, to be honest, the whole first morning into probably lunchtime, early afternoon of my first, like my day one of this hunt. We were just trying to find sign of life basically. And aside from a few, ponies, they've got these what's called Timor ponies up there, which are smaller, equine species. We were seeing heaps of bird life, whether it was kookaburras, kingfishers, different pigeons and stuff like that. Like, there was never something to not look at, but we were just sort of not finding any big game. But the one thing that we kept doing was following like little tiny game trails like in the dirt that were probably there from earlier in the year. And then as we kept following these game trails, eventually we finally hit a little bit of sign. And honestly, from finding that first bit of sign and some feces from a bangtang, we noticed that there were some flies on it. And then from there, it would have been like 100, 200 meters. And we finally located our first bangtang bull. And that you hear in the video footage, I'm like, this is a bit of a pinch yourself moment. And it was so cool to just see one in the flesh. And this was a lone bull, nothing that we were actually after in terms of, not a mature bull that we wanted to take or try and stalk or anything. But we were able to creep in pretty easily to about 37 meters. Again, he was unsuspecting of anything. We had the wind right and had, snuck into about 37 meters, ranged him, did a bit of a practice stalk and, continued on our way. But where we were hunting pretty dry terrain, I'd say. Like, a lot of it this is kilometers away from the floodplains. And we were following these game trails, trying to get closer to the floodplains, which is where we anticipated the animals to be. But as we did sort of close that proximity, we started noticing a few cows and a few mobs of young bulls with cows and all this type of stuff. And that's sort of truly where my hunt, I think, comes into play, is early afternoon now to set the scene. The temperature was pretty hot. It was probably 30, if not 40 degrees. We'd had a bit of a walk to get into where we were, but the sign was just immense and we started seeing some animals. And that's where I think what was pretty noticeable is I just remember, again, this dry terrain, seeing like dust up ahead. And what was really cool, and if you watch some of the footage, is you see these animals that are quite big. They're moving across this dry landscape and they literally would kick up dust. And you'd see this from a few hundred meters away, if not up to a kilometer away. And you'd put the glass up and sort of be able to track these animals if they were moving across the landscape. And we ended up just honing in on this basically activity in front of us. And what it revealed was literally, I'd say, probably 30 or more bulls. And they were chasing a handful of cows. And where we sort of, I guess, end up being real successful was that we closed into where we thought they were going and let them cover the last little bit of distance. And again, we had, what you don't see on the video is that I'm obviously there with the bow. James is behind me with the video camera, and then Dad's behind James, sort of just taking it all in, enjoying the atmosphere and the scenery and the hunt and everything like that. But a few of the important, I guess, factors are that this one cow that was in season, and the way that James and I know that she was in season as veterinarians is that she was what we call standing to be mounted. And what that is they'll often in their urine, have pheromones and things. And the other cows were actually smelling, and the bulls obviously could smell it, were that she had certain levels of whether it's estrogen, whatever it may be, in her urine saying that, yep, she's ready to mate. And that's what they're smelling. And when she is truly ready to mate, she'll stand there and let the other animals like sort of mount her. And there was a fair few cows doing this, as you'll see in the video. But what that was doing was sort of signaling to all these bulls. And as I said, there was about 30 different bulls just in an orbit or a bit of a bait ball, sort of to give an analogy. We're just literally surrounding this cow, and they would come in, try and, secure her. And then the mature bull would chase them off. And this was just basically continually happening in front of us for like an hour or so until we could eventually get within bow range. And one thing I remember seeing was this cow kept presenting to us on her left-hand side, and she was like 20 meters away. And I was like, how is she not seeing us? Because there wasn't a heap of cover. And I knew, and she was kind of looking dead our way. But what was really cool, and you'll see it maybe in the footage if you look closely, is that she had this real glassed over left-hand side eye. And I actually would dare say that she was blind in that left-hand side eye, which is pretty cool. Like she might have had a bit of cataracts or some sort of scarring or something from like an ulcer where her eyes rubbed up against something hard, or a stick's gone in there, or whatever's happened. She's had some sort of injury. But her being blind in that eye actually afforded me in the end to be able to draw a bit easier on this bull. And it's really cool just noticing those little factors when I look at how the success of the stalk sort of unfolds and whatnot. But I won't go too far into the details as to taking the bull. I'll let you guys obviously watch that, and if you have watched it, then you can see what unfolds. But what happened with that stalk and that hunt is that I was able to ultimately be successful with taking a mature bull. And to be honest, heading into it, I had no idea of what a mature banteng looked like. All I knew at the end of this stalk was that, if I compared it to a deer species, if I watched a fallow buck challenging 30 other rivals and, was able to secure the cow or the doe or whatever and keep them at bay, then I'd say that he's probably a mature buck. And that's sort of what I went by. And I was super happy to obviously take that bull on the first day and have him run probably about 100 meters and go down and expire. Purely from like just the actual hunt itself was incredible. And to have one arrow kill and see him go down was like amazing as well. But secondly, it also afforded us more time as well, in my opinion, for James to then go about and, be really selective with the next few days. And also just, I was worried that if I'd turned down, too many opportunities, that it would reduce James's time to then be able to hunt. And to be honest, I had from seeing what was on our front door in the morning, I had a real keenness to, I guess, explore this countryside a bit more if we could fit in as much action as we could into the trip, which as you'll hear in a second, was, definitely not shy of adventure and action over the coming days.
We all know when it comes to great tasting coffee in the outdoors, look no further than Dog and Gun Coffee. But the same great tasting coffee can also be enjoyed in their whole bean variety in the comfort of your own home. Rounded out with their incredible hog chockey, Dog and Gun has something for everyone. Use code TWIN10 at checkout for $10 off your first order. Discover your brew of choice today. I think one thing that I learnt, and I think Ayden sort of got the raw end of the stick in both scenarios, to be honest. Like normally it's can be a positive and a negative, I guess, going first on any hunt, like especially with Ayden and I, doing the filming for you guys and also then the hunting. It's sort of, if you do a hunt and you only get one opportunity, well, there's a guy that essentially just films for the whole hunt. And I mean, going into this, like we'd obviously been told by Pato that, there was heaps of banteng up here and we're going to get plenty of opportunities and stuff, but you just never know. Like that's hunting. Like, and so, I mean, I say this in terms of both his banteng and his boar hunt. Like Ayden was very much the pioneer being first, and I definitely was able to capitalize off his hunts, I guess, just with knowing where to go. Like, because like Ayden said, we spent a fair part of a morning and a lot of kilometers just walking around trying to find, like we had suspicions that, and we're following, good game trails and good sort of leading lines in the bush, like following these depressions where we think the feed are and stuff. But it wasn't until we really, worked out that the banteng were mainly on the floodplains and that the cows were sort of walking further off the floodplain than the bulls, and the bulls were really just staying on the floodplain and then sort of walking into these paper barks within, like most of the mature bulls were within 1 to 500 meters in these paper barks, and the cows probably going up to a kilometer and a half, where we'd started like kilometers off and sort of walked there, but it wasn't until we got there that we realized that. And especially after seeing Ayden stalk, like he said, like having 30 bulls chasing one cow in season, well, it quickly became apparent that there was going to be plenty of opportunities. And so when it came to my hunt, I guess I sort of said to Ayden, hey, I'm pretty keen on trying to find a really good bull. And so as you'll see in the video, like I ended up taking an awesome Banteng, which I'm stoked with, absolutely over the moon with. But we ended up having 3 encounters with the same bull, which was awesome, just to sort of build that character and rapport and have that storyline with just one bull. But the interesting thing that I guess for you guys to learn from was he was bedded up pretty much within, like we sort of kept walking the same area hoping to find that bull. And what we found was like he bedded up sort of within 100, 150 meters along that same little creek, or spring, I should say. It wasn't a creek, a couple of days in a row, which sort of makes you think, well, we were hunting fairly high densities and populations, but you can probably extrapolate that out where, if you've got limited water courses, you're expecting that the bulls are probably going to be where the good feed are and where the good water are. And you'd expect that the bulls are probably going to be closest to that, with the cows maybe, going up into the ridges a bit more, for example, and bedding up and then coming back down. Sort of late arvo. But yeah, the bulls also, I think just from once they get to that level, like we, on a recent trip, we actually saw some dingoes hunting some Banteng calves, and from all accounts, like with the hike, you can't actually hunt wild dogs or dingoes in Cobourg. So the dingoes there, like we had some awesome encounters with some dingoes while we're up there, and even on a recent trip, we actually saw 2 dingoes hunting a calf off a mother and stuff like that. And while we were up there, we actually saw a dingo come in and eat some remains of a calf that had obviously died a couple of weeks before, with how like limited feed there was and like how dry the hide was and everything like that. But so obviously the dingoes do give the Banteng calves a fair hiding, and do get predated on a fair bit. But those bulls, obviously, being mature, unless they've got, they're becoming lame or nutritionally challenged or something like that, just from old age and teeth or injuries or from fighting and stuff like that, like they're not really threatened by wild dogs and dingoes. So they weren't really moving too far off the floodplain, which definitely helped, coming off the knowledge of Ayden's hunt. So I was able to really just focus my efforts, and to be honest, it was just finding the bulls that we wanted to stalk. Like we would see, dozens of bulls every day, and yeah, can say that probably the bulls that you see me stalk in the film were the top end of that. But yeah, there was plenty of bulls to stalk, which meant that we could capitalize and really pick our way through and find some awesome bulls. And I think, for me, really, I mean, it's typical, like, even though the wind in the middle of the day, whenever, for me, the wind was probably the biggest factor that sort of, we were hunting, just the way that we sort of had to hunt. We were hunting a pretty solid crosswind most of the time. And to be honest, it was most of the time hunting around those little springs and whatnot, where, a cloud may come over and the wind may just drop off a little bit. And especially when you're in close quarters and you want to make sure you're doing a good shot on a Banteng, these big animals, like, yeah, you're sort of not really shooting that often, quartering on. You're sort of waiting for your shot, and yeah, you're sitting there waiting, especially if they're bedded and they've got a lot of bone covering up where you want to hit them. And, then the wind just quickly switches and they run off. So it was a challenging hunt in that sense. I think also, to be honest, the fact that there was so many animals there was a little bit challenging too. Just from the point of view where, you'd start going through the paper barks and you're looking through bulls and, no, I don't want that one. And, I'm not going to stalk that one. You move around and you're quiet and stuff, but inevitably animals get your wind, whether it be, the wind's blowing in any direction, and then those animals get up and run off, and then the animals in front that you're looking at, take off as well. But, we still had plenty of incredible encounters, and I mean, we didn't even scratch the surface of the potential country that they have opportunities to hunt up there. And like I said, every day we're seeing dozens and dozens of really good bulls, and it was just cool. I guess for me, just being sort of immersed in it, and having the privilege, like time wise, like I said, Ayden had shot his bull in the first day, which was sort of great for me. To really sort of capitalize on having a bit more time and try and find a really good bull and just enjoy the hunt. Like we saw some incredible wildlife, as we get into in a second, with like the dingoes and just the kookaburras and the kingfishers and the swamp harriers and all these birds of prey, and even like just mobs of pigs and stuff like that. And I mean, it's just an exceptional part of the world where, because it's so remote, the animals, they're still very switched on, but they're not that really dialed in where, something breaks a stick and they go sprinting off. They sort of do allow you to just be in their environment. And because of that, you get to witness some, like breathtaking scenery, breathtaking sunsets, and beautiful wildlife encounters. So, make sure to check out the video. My one is a little bit longer than Ayden, just because I was lucky enough to go and hunt for a couple of days longer and have some really cool stalks and really cool encounters. But there's plenty of wildlife stuff in there, as you'll see, that I'm sure you're very familiar with our videos. And it was great to immerse ourselves in all of Cobourg has to offer, and be able to capitalize and get a fantastic bull at the end of it was just the cherry on top, I guess. But it was definitely a very memorable hunt up there at Cobourg with Dingo Creek.
I guess there's one thing I wanted to chat on there. You sort of spoke briefly about the pigs and stuff that we're seeing, and one theme that seems to be coming up in the YouTube comments, especially with people watching, is like, how come you weren't shooting more pigs? How come you weren't shooting more pigs? And again, part 1 and 2 of this 4-part series is definitely focused on the Banteng. And it wasn't that we weren't keen to shoot the pigs. It's just that we had such a focus on, we were only there for like 6 days or something like that. And again, one day was occupied with me trying to shoot a bull. And then as far as we were concerned, it was like we were there to hunt Banteng. And whilst it was cool to see a few pigs, we weren't going to deviate too much from our plan to go and shoot a sow or suckers. It wasn't like a pest control mission, unfortunately. And again, to a certain degree, we can't necessarily just give context in these films. So whilst you see a bit of the scenery and the pigs and the ponies and all this type of stuff, what you don't see is that, Pato and the people that he brings in, a lot of them are rifle hunters. A lot of them are, people from the US, a lot of them who have never shot a pig. So for us to go and shoot sows seemed a bit silly, considering that we were bow hunting and had 5 arrows in a quiver. I'm not saying we're going to use them all, but like, we didn't want to shoot a pig and take photos with it and do this and do like what we normally do, unless it was like a mature boar that was something truly extraordinary, to deviate us from James's goal of like shooting a Banteng, for example. And again, to give greater context, the pigs do immense damage up there in the Northern Territory. And like, again, whilst we didn't necessarily shoot any sows or piglets, it's like Pato and those guys do drive around on buggies after they've shot a Banteng bull. And there were some days they were coming back to camp saying, we shot 50 pigs today. So it's like, rest assured they are doing it. It's just that on our particular, mission and with our particular, set of priorities, and the fact that we were hunting with a bow with, an arrow that is much more prone to breaking and stuff like that, we were trying to shoot a Banteng first. And then, as you'll see from part 3 and 4, we obviously go in and get the job done on a few pigs once the bow hunting for the Banteng sort of done. But again, it's just, that's where the avenue of talking through a podcast, and we can give you guys a bit more background into the hunt. But there certainly was no shortage of pigs. And we did see some massive boars. And again, it was cool to just watch, the dingoes hunting piglets and stuff. So I know that with a lot more dingoes, which are protected and not able to be hunted at all there in Cobourg, they obviously give the feral pigs a hiding. And to be honest, we didn't see very many piglets at all. Like, you'd either see mature pigs or no pigs in a sense. And I think that is just probably because of the presence of dingoes and obviously their success as the apex predator there in the Northern Territory.
One extra thing that I'd like to add to my sort of story and hunt, I guess, that I forgot to mention was we end up having a few camera issues with, I think it's an A7 IV. Is that correct?
Yeah, the Sony A7R, Mark IV.
Yeah, and just you'll see in the final stalk on the YouTube video, essentially it goes from me being like half drawn to me being at full draw and then shooting the Banteng. And it was pretty lucky that I probably held for so long, because what actually happened was the bull, as you see in the video, he's bedded, and I stalk into about 20 odd meters, 22 meters from memory, and he's bedded, and he finally stands up after quite a long wait. I think it was about 45 minutes, maybe longer. And I sneak around the tree and get the angle that I'm waiting for, and, go to draw back. And I just remember like I'm just about to sort of be halfway through my draw cycle, and I just hear, and I just remember like my heart just like, just sort of like sank this little bit. And just remember turning around and sort of looking at Ayden, and he's like pointing at the camera, and he's like, doing like as if like sort of cutting his throat, like it's not, like hand gesture being like it's not working. And he's pointing at the thing and like pointing at the sun. He's like, it's like overheating and stuff and shit. So then he's like turned the camera off for a bit, and he's and Ayden's, probably I'm 20 meters off the bull. Ayden's probably 40 meters behind me, so 60 meters away in the shade. And he's videoing with the little lens, the 24 to 70, but the big 150 to 600, which was sort of what we were banking on, wasn't really working. And so, sadly, we sort of sit there for a bit, and the bull reshuffles and stuff. And I actually didn't realize that he sort of shuffled and became a little bit more quartering on than he was like perfectly broadside. So I may have hit him probably a little bit too far back for the shot. Like he probably should have been an inch or two forward, but still well and truly did the job. Like Cobourg pilot cut there, like, I mean, they do big holes, so sort of got in and did the job. But he, he'd shifted and changed his angle before I noticed. And eventually I looked back at Ayden, and Ayden's like, yep, giving me the thumbs up. And that's why you sort of only see me half draw, because the main camera that we're filming with actually got overheated again, turned off, and Ayden's quickly scrambled with the little lens and, it got it all in focus and stuff. And you pretty much just get me like squeezing off the shot. A bit of a mix up there with the cameras. Pretty lucky to have got it all on film and captured it, which, for us is obviously a super high priority, where I probably wouldn't have shot if it wasn't on film. So I'm glad that it all worked out.
Yeah, and I think you guys know, obviously, from watching most of our films, that it's either James or myself filming. Very rarely, unless we're filming another hunter, do we actually get two different people wielding one camera, trying to get the different angles and stuff. So constantly throughout this adventure, it's sort of, we'd have the big camera on a tripod in one hand, and then running along with either a gimbal or handheld 24 to 70 mil camera, trying to get all the B-roll, little snippets, audio, voiceovers, all this type of stuff. So we're pretty much working, running and gunning the whole time. And then to finally, for 3 or 4 days, be following James, get it down to a point where like I've got the tripod sitting in front of me in the shade. I think I was only 40 meters from the bull. Like we were pretty close. I was only 20 or so meters behind James, filming over his shoulder, like have it framed perfectly, saving the battery, like you're monitoring all this stuff. Like, am I in the shade so the camera is not glistening? It was hot. Like, don't get us wrong, it was stinking hot, but it had been hotter in previous days. Hadn't really had an issue with it overheating. And then for it to be like turning off as James is drawing, that's why I whistled. I was like, it's turned off. And I did have it filming. So I had, if you can imagine where this podcast mic is sitting in front of my face, is where the 150 to 600 mil lens is on a tripod. And then just offhand to that, to the right, I'm filming with a little handheld 24 to 70 mil just to get, the wider angle of the draw and all this type of stuff. So they're very complementary. Like we can do cuts from each other and capture the shot super close in on the bull, and then one that's more wide, catch him running off and stuff. Like it's just very thorough. And to have that main one go down, I was like in a bit of a rush, sort of dropping with trying to then turn it off and on with one hand while holding the other camera. And then I'd already whistled at James once to say, no, like don't shoot it, like come down from full draw. He drew back again. And just as he was about to shoot, I noticed that the camera's died. So I try to like turn it on and off again. And that's why like with the camera that's in my hand, it's a little bit shaky. But anyway, we ended up capturing it, but it was pretty heartbreaking to like lug, kilograms worth of camera gear around, have it perfect for 90% of the stalk. And that stalk by no means was like a 2-minute stalk like you see in the video footage, because, we can only share so much with you. It's hours of, walking before we find the bull. We finally find the bull. You spend half an hour trying to get into 20 meters, and then he's sitting there at 22 meters for, whether it's an hour, 30 minutes, half an hour, 45 minutes, whatever it may be, only for in a split second that camera to turn off, and it sort of be too late. Was a bit of a low point, but it just goes to show that that's probably why we carry around 2 cameras and do all the type of stuff that we're doing. And I think the film still obviously, reaches a point where you see enough of the storyline, but it's just one of those what ifs. What if we did capture it on 2 angles? It just would have made that memory all the sweeter. But unfortunately, that's the reality of hunting in, harsh, remote areas that are dusty. We're trying to carry all the camera gear and battery around, clean it as much as possible, keep it cool. But camera issues is something that we're just going to have to live with, unfortunately.
Cayuga broadheads. Where do I begin? Ayden and I have just absolutely taken to and loved these broadheads. He's shooting the 150 grain Zots while I'm shooting the 150 grain pilot cuts with bleeders. There was no other head that I was going to run in Montana on my limited entry hunt than the pilot cut. And I was so happy when I took down the bull of a lifetime. We've teamed up with Cayuga to get 10% off your next order by using the code TWIN10 at checkout. That is TWIN, 10 the number at checkout to get 10% off your next order.
So for me, I think we've spoken plenty about the hunting, and then obviously in previous podcasts, we've spoken a lot about the bedded boars, and you've obviously seen by now a lot of the reels and shorts and snippets that we've chucked up on social media of just some of, the bow hunting, I guess, features and even the general wildlife footage of the Banteng. And not many people in Australia, let alone the world, have probably hunted Banteng. So to be able to experience this and get so much content has been incredible, and it's been very well received by you guys, like our audience. But one of the experiences, I guess, that probably speaks the most to me and was one of my favorite things, where I remember like filming it and seeing it and living it in the time and just going, I can't wait to actually share this with people, was, again, because the dingoes up there are protected. They are very rarely, and it's so remote up there, they very rarely come in contact with mankind, whether it's, white people or the indigenous people who have lived there for thousands of years. It's just such a remote landscape. And we had this encounter when James was hunting on our last hunting day. And it was early in the morning, and we'd just come back to this lagoon where we'd had a bit of success the night before shooting a few boars. And again, we obviously were thinking of going there with the expectation to try and shoot a few boars off this very limited water source and resource, because there was probably no crocodile in there. But what you don't think about is obviously the bird life. And as soon as we got there were like hundreds of brolgas on it. There were water buffalo. There were also, in this situation or circumstance, a dingo bitch, so the female dingo. And there was about 3 or 4 young pups with her. And when I say young pups, they were probably the size of like a big dachshund or, a small little beagle sort of sized dog. And what was really cool was you could see the bitch, she was covered in mud right up to her chest. So she'd probably obviously waded out to the water, got a drink, because she looked like she was still sort of probably weaning, if not nursing those pups a little bit. But what was really cool is like, whilst we were like, as we always try and do, it's so much more than a bow hunt. And whilst there were pigs around to try and shoot, we saw this dingo, and I branched off from Dad and James to go and video her with these pups. And you'll hopefully see some of this really up close footage where, we've got this dingo bitch walking through all the logs and the paper barks and climbing over stuff and looking around intently. Like, there's times she, I swear, looks at me as this, weird object in her landscape, but just probably never experienced like an upright human being or a threat of a human. She looks at me for a second, looks away, continues mucking around with the pups. The pups are playing, chewing on things. Like, it was just insane to be a part of and in that landscape and sharing it. And again, some of my most fond memories. But what was really cool is she just kept coming closer and closer and closer. And eventually she got to like 5 meters. And I think because I was tracking her with the camera, like fully zoomed out, just trying to video her. And to be honest, it got to the point where she moved from my 12 o'clock, if you can imagine, to sort of towards my 9. And I could no longer video her through the viewfinder without like obviously moving and trying to move the camera a lot and turn and pivot. So I was just sort of moving my hand where I thought she was. And I just remember watching her with my naked eye, like not through the viewfinder, and she started growling and huffing. And what was really cool is the pups were trailing her and getting closer and closer to me, obviously, because as I said, she was only 5 meters away. And I just remember her doing this really coarse sort of hackling like bark where it was almost like a woof / a bark where that was, I think, her way of saying to the pups, like, run, like as if a mother just screaming at her pups, like, or her kids saying run. And all the pups were super confused, but they all ran off in different directions away from where she was. And then she immediately like hackles raised, and she was only a tiny, skinny little thing. Like she's, competing in a harsh environment to obviously get enough food and stuff to feed all these hungry pups. But you could see like her hackles raised, her eyes were just like eyeballing me, this real amber sort of color. And I remember just thinking, like, where else on earth would you have this experience? And she was growling at this point, and not once did I feel necessarily threatened by her. Like she was only a small little animal, and to be honest, I was sort of hidden behind a tripod and camera gear and whatnot. But it was more just the like intense like nature like stuff where it's just like you feel like you're part of this interaction that not many people ever get to experience. And she sort of went around me, hit my wind, and then took off back towards the pups. And she'd obviously thought that she'd bought enough time and stuff, and the pups took off and they all scattered. But what was cool is we gave them a bit of time and then continued trying to look for pigs. And we went maybe 100 more meters, and suddenly like one of the pups which had run off was sitting in front of us at 5 meters and had probably lost mum for a second. And then we can hear her howling, the pups howling, and they were communicating obviously to try and get back to one another. And it was just cool to watch these little pups at 20 meters now calling out and howling and watch. I remember like one thing that sticks by me is the mum came back looking for the pups, got to a range where she's like, oh, I should be able to find them by now, but I'll find them later this afternoon when it starts cooling down, is probably like how I anthropomorphize and think that she was probably acting. And I remember just watching her tuck into this little bit of a tussock grass. And if I hadn't have seen it, you'd never believe where she like crept into this little crevice. And the only thing you could see were the whites of her teeth when she was panting. And the rest of her was just completely hidden in this dark little cave-like sort of structure. And I hope it makes it into the video footage, because it's absolutely like awesome to see this dingo, which is, the size of a kelpie or a medium-sized dog, literally just slink away into this tiny little crevice under a little bit of a tuft of grass. And just that's where she's obviously seeking out that intense heat of the day. And to go from that until, what ended up being our last day of Bowhunting Boars, and like going back to that water source and stuff where we were then hunting pigs in the heat of the day, and their way of getting out of the heat was to go and wallow in the water and stuff, was it was just all so complementary to one another. And just, again, the way that we hunt, it doesn't matter about if it's a big boar or a Banteng bull or whatever, or if it's like a willy wagtail sitting on a fence post, or in this instance, a dingo and its pups, or a crocodile, whatever. We're there for it. And the whole, I guess, nature and adventure component of Cobourg was just absolutely next level. And very much for that reason, I'd encourage anyone to, if they can, one, afford to get up there, and two, do it, before things get either too highly regulated or potentially like inaccessible. Definitely get in touch with Paddo and try and organize a trip, because this is, the more I think about it, the more I look at footage and stuff, the more I talk to people about it. It's just one of those trips that I'll never forget, from the things that I saw and experienced to just sharing the adventure with my family, which was absolutely amazing.
Well, that wraps up this week's episode. As I'm sure you guys can hear how passionate Ayden and I were about this Cobourg trip, and hopefully that comes through not only in this podcast, but also the videos that you guys have hopefully watched up on our YouTube. It was a truly spectacular trip, and one we won't forget shortly, especially being able to go back and watch that footage and watch the videos, which is so important to us. But now we're going to just jump into our FAQ segment, which I'm sure you guys are very familiar with. If you guys have a question that you'd like us to answer on the podcast, please email that in to info@twinelements.com.au with the subject line FAQ. Equally, you can send us a message on the Twin Elements, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, or James Doumtsis Outdoors Instagram account, and we will answer it here in a future podcast. So this question was sent in by Victor Guzman. I want to ask about a potential podcast topic on chitaldy hunting tips, tricks, calling, and strategies. I recently got on a hunt at a ranch that had monsters, but they are very tough animals. Thanks for your time. Keep on kicking ass. Thank you, Victor. We really appreciate it. And I reckon I'll let Ayden tackle this one, since he's the expert chital man.
So as far as obviously being able to hunt strategy like chital and breaking them down, I would say the biggest thing for mine is patience is the key. whether that's ambush hunting if there's a lot of deer and they sort of frequent one sort of area, or they feed in one area and then go and travel to bed in another one. That sort of obviously then brings in the concept of potentially intercepting these animals, especially if you've got like the topography that allows for it to occur. So if you're hunting them, in Maui, in the mountains, or in North Queensland where you've got little creeks and gullies and things like that, if you can use the topography and the lay of the land to sort of get to a spot and intercept them as they walk through a game trail or even on the basalt wall, then that's going to obviously afford you more circumstances to try and get in close and close the gap on, definitely, as you said, a very elusive animal. The other thing would be potentially even looking at like tree stands for, again, ambush hunting if you've got them patterned to a certain area. Otherwise, where James and I and a lot of our guided hunts and stuff obviously specialize in are these super, super slow and I guess calculated stalks on deer, primarily when they're bedded in the middle sort of few hours of the day, when for us, like the wind's best and it's the highest chance of having success. As you've said in this question, which I think I'll probably spend the most time on, when it comes to calling chital deer, it's definitely possible, just like any other deer. They certainly rut, want to mate, all those things have that lustfulness. So for mine, there's either two methods generally to doing that. So one is rattling antlers, trying to attract obviously the stags and bring them in. Or two, you can use something like a diaphragm call, or we've used like a hoochie mama, which is an elk call from Primos in America in the past, and that works quite well on chital deer. Again, you've got to play around with it a little bit, and what you're trying to do most of the time is do either a hind call or a fawn in distress call, and most of the time you're bringing in a hind, and often she's followed by the stag. Sometimes if you call to a stag, they'll hear it and literally walk the other way, as to be honest is the case with a lot of the chital deer calling. The third thing is that chital deer do their bellow or their call, which we many years ago quite famously recorded a really monstrous chital stag calling, which sort of went viral on a number of different Instagram sites and stuff like that. Like a lot of people hadn't really seen them calling like that, let alone to get the footage up close was pretty cool. But again, I've never really had amazing success in calling them in. A lot of the time they come in so acutely front on. You can't really also always pick which deer is going to come in, which deer is going to hear it and sort of move the other direction. So for me, I'd rather, again, just control that impulse to try and call and then wait for more of a super, I guess, slow and calculated stalk to try and get on the deer. The biggest thing in the way I compare it is like when you're doing a predator call or even on an animal like an elk, you're calling, for an elk, for example, if there's a bugling bull elk and you're calling like a cow call, they're in the rut. You're targeting them when they're most active and trying to breed, trying to find the cows. Whereas chital deer, it's kind of hard to pinpoint that because not every female is going through estrus at the same time or in like a rut period. And again, in the instance of a predator and a predator call, no matter how hungry I am, if someone offers me the opportunity for a snack, I'm kind of going to want to go and investigate, I guess. And that's where if you're calling to a chital deer stag and you think, I'm going to try rattling antlers, if that stag's just been bashed last week, there's no way he's going to want to go and get jumped by another stag again. He's more likely to run the complete opposite direction. And the same goes for, again, if you're trying a diaphragm call or a hoochie mama call and trying to, imitate a young fawn or a hind or something like that, sure, you might bring a hind in, but if that stag is 10 steps behind and you're hunting with a bow and he's now coming in front on, there's no way you're going to be able to shoot him anyway. So again, you definitely can try calling. My biggest thing is not really a trick. It is a bit of a tip, I guess, but it's just go super, super slow, use your binoculars a lot and try and, basically do really calculated stalks. And I commonly just ask myself, is what I'm trying to achieve going to get me, potentially busted, or am I just trying to stay in the game for as long as I can until hopefully a shot presents? And that's sort of how I do it. It's very boring, unfortunately. Takes a lot of patience and discipline, but it does often get it done on the chital deer, which I've come to sort of, experience time and time again, which is why I love playing the game with them. It's very much process based, but it does get the results. So thanks very much for your question, Victor. We appreciate you writing in, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into some more chiddle deer hunting. Best of luck. With unmatched quality, performance, and reputation, Aimright International is a family and community-focused business. They're our go-to for spear guns, wetsuits, and fins. Whether it be a simple shore dive, island hopping, days on the reef, or bigger dives in the vast blue, Aimright has you covered underwater.
So to wrap up this podcast, as you guys are hearing this, Ayden and I are very much getting ready to head over to the US. So luckily enough, between us, we have been able to draw 3 tags each, so 6 tags total. We've got a deer and elk combo each in Montana, as well as a pronghorn tag. So we are going to be super excited. We're going to be leaving in early September, and we're going to be over there for a month. So hopefully we can tag out and a fair few of these tags. I mean, it's going to be epic footage for you guys to watch in the future anyway. But we're going to be shifting gears and we're going to be doing some US themed podcasts starting next week. So you guys have that to look forward to. We will be pretty quiet on socials during that period in terms of answering questions and stuff. We will have limited service, so we will be trying to put up stories and that type of thing, but it may be quite difficult, as you guys can imagine, but we will endeavour to try and share those stories with you guys because we know that you guys love it so much. But hopefully you guys enjoy the future US-based podcasts, and we'll get back to all your questions and any help that we can assist you guys with once we're back in Australia in full swing, more in the start of sort of early October and stuff like that. So September's purely going to be us hunting over there, and fingers crossed we can punch a few of these tags into some elk or mule deer or an antelope.
As a listener of this podcast, you can now be rewarded when shopping on our Twin Elements website. Simply use the code The Twin Elements Podcast for 10% off any prints orders. With around 40 or so prints, we've got buffalo, elk, chiddle deer. We've got all different wildlife, some from Cobourg, some Banteng, as you would have heard in this podcast. There's literally something there for everyone, which we are very proud of. Every purchase of a print directly supports us, and then we love seeing them up in your houses, homes, office, whatever it may be. They make amazing gifts, and we've put a lot of time and effort into getting those out and available for you guys. So every shop or order is very greatly appreciated.
Lastly, thank you guys for your continued support here on the podcast and across all our media platforms, whether it be on our Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and of course YouTube, where you guys can see all our adventures, including this Northern Territory series, which we've been putting up recently and obviously discussing through here on the podcast. So thank you for everyone supporting that. We also appreciate everyone that subscribes, reviews, and rates the podcast. It obviously does help it get shared to more people, and hopefully they can value this resource that we're putting out there. So thank you very much, everyone, for your love and support. We do appreciate it. We appreciate all the messages, that we get, just valuing sort of our time and inputs into, making sure that we keep the content coming across all these platforms. So thank you very much for, just fueling our fire and keeping us going. So, please keep sending all those through, and don't forget to review, rate, and subscribe to the podcast. It means the world to us. But we will catch you next time on the next episode of the Twin Elements podcast.
See you then, guys. Thanks, legends.